The grass had grown a little longer than usual, that was true. A few wildflowers had crept in where they weren't exactly planned. The edges weren't perfectly trimmed, and the symmetry that the neighborhood prided itself on had quietly slipped away over the past few weeks. But to anyone passing by without a measuring stick and a clipboard, it looked less like neglect and more like nature taking a gentle breath. Still, in a neighborhood governed by strict rules, appearances weren't just preferences. They were expectations. And expectations, when enforced by the wrong person, could quickly turn into something else entirely. The first notice arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, slipped neatly into the mailbox as though it were just another piece of ordinary mail. But its tone was anything but ordinary. It was precise, cold, and unmistakably formal. It referenced specific clauses, cited maintenance standards, and ended with a warning that compliance was required within a defined number of days. The issue was simple, according to the document. The lawn was in violation. Not destroyed, not hazardous, not overrun with anything dangerous. Just not compliant. At first, there was a moment of confusion, then a brief flicker of irritation. But mostly there was disbelief. The grass wasn't even that tall. In fact, it had been intentionally left that way. It was part of a small personal effort to move away from perfectly manicured, lifeless lawns and toward something a little more organic. Something that supported pollinators, reduced water use, and felt a little less artificial. But that nuance didn't exist in the HOA's rulebook. A few days passed without action. Life was busy, and the notice felt like something that could wait. After all, it wasn't urgent in any meaningful sense. No one was being harmed. Nothing was being damaged. It was just grass. Then came the second notice. This one was less polite. The language had sharpened. The deadline had shortened. The implication was clear. Failure to comply would result in fines. Not symbolic fines either. The kind that accumulate quickly and quietly, turning minor disagreements into expensive problems. That was when suspicion began to form. HOA notices didn't usually escalate that quickly without a trigger. Someone had to have reported it. Someone had taken the time to notice, to document, and to push it forward. And in a neighborhood like this, there was only one person known for that level of enthusiasm. She had a reputation. The kind that didn't need confirmation because it was visible in the way people adjusted their behavior when she was nearby. Lawns were trimmed a little tighter. Trash bins were pulled in a little faster. Decorations were kept within a very narrow interpretation of acceptable. She was always watching. And more importantly, she always acted. The realization settled in quietly but firmly. This wasn't about grass. It was about control. That understanding changed everything. The initial reaction wasn't anger. It was something more calculated. A pause, a step back, a decision not to respond immediately, but to observe. Because situations like this had a pattern, and understanding the pattern mattered more than reacting to the first move. The lawn remained as it was. Days passed. The weather stayed warm, encouraging the grass to grow just a little taller. The wildflowers spread slightly wider. What had once looked like a minor deviation began to look more intentional, more defined. Still not chaotic. Still not messy. Just different. And that difference seemed to attract attention. The third notice arrived exactly when expected. This time, it included a fine. It wasn't a small one. The document outlined the previous warnings, referenced the continued noncompliance, and applied a financial penalty accordingly. It also included a schedule for additional fines if the issue wasn't resolved immediately. That was the moment where most people would have given in. Trimmed the lawn, paid the fine, moved on. But something about the situation made that option feel wrong. Because the lawn, in its current state, wasn't actually violating any clear, objective standard. The rules were vague, open to interpretation. They spoke about maintained appearance and community standards, but they didn't define exact measurements. They relied on subjective judgment. And subjective judgment could be challenged. That realization sparked an idea. If the issue was perception, then perception could be changed. The next few days were quiet on the surface but busy behind the scenes. Research began, not into lawn care but into regulations. Into what was allowed, what wasn't, and more importantly, what couldn't be easily restricted. native plants, pollinator-friendly gardens, environmental initiatives. These weren't just trends. They were increasingly protected in various regions. Some even had legal backing that limited the power of HOAs to enforce traditional landscaping standards. The pieces started to come together. The lawn wasn't going to be fixed. It was going to be transformed. Not into something compliant, but into something undeniable. The shift began subtly. A few additional plants were introduced, carefully selected for their resilience and their visual impact. Small signs appeared, not decorative but informational. They explained the purpose of the space, the benefits to local ecosystems, the reasoning behind the choices being made. What had once been seen as neglect began to look intentional. And intention was harder to criticize. The next notice from the HOA reflected that confusion. The language was less certain, the accusations less direct. It still referenced the previous violations, but it struggled to categorize what the lawn had become. It wasn't unmaintained anymore. It was something else. That uncertainty created space. And space allowed for expansion. The transformation accelerated. Pathways were outlined. More plants were added, each chosen not just for appearance but for purpose. The lawn was no longer a lawn in the traditional sense. It was evolving into something that didn't fit neatly into the HOA's existing framework. Neighbors began to notice. First, it was curiosity. A few slowed steps while walking by. A second glance where there hadn't been one before. Then came the photos. Casual at first, then more deliberate. Something interesting was happening. And interesting things tend to spread. The HOA, meanwhile, found itself in an increasingly difficult position. The original complaint had been straightforward. The solution had seemed simple. But the situation had shifted into something more complex, something that couldn't be resolved with a standard notice or a simple fine. Because the lawn wasn't just a lawn anymore. It was becoming a statement. And statements, once made, are hard to ignore. As the days turned into weeks, the attention grew. What had started as a minor dispute began to take on a life of its own. The transformation was no longer just about one property or one complaint. It was becoming something bigger, something that reached beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. And that was when the first unexpected visitor arrived. Not a neighbor, not an HOA representative, someone from outside, someone who had heard about the lawn, someone who saw it not as a problem, but as something worth seeing. That moment marked a turning point. Because once attention comes from the outside, it changes the rules of the game entirely. They walked slowly along the edge of the property, taking in the details with a kind of deliberate curiosity that didn't belong to the usual rhythm of the neighborhood. Their phone came out more than once, capturing angles, textures, and the small informational signs that had started to dot the lawn. There was no confrontation, no confusion, just quiet interest. But what mattered wasn't how long they stayed. It was the fact that they had come at all. Because in a neighborhood where everything was designed to look the same, where uniformity was enforced and deviation was discouraged, the idea that someone would intentionally seek out something different was disruptive. That disruption didn't take long to spread. Within days, there were more visitors. Not crowds, not yet, but enough to be noticeable. A couple in the afternoon. A small group over the weekend. Someone who lingered longer than expected, studying the layout as if it were more than just a yard. And in a way, it was. The transformation had reached a point where it could no longer be mistaken for neglect. The pathways had become more defined, guiding movement naturally through the space. The plants had grown fuller, their arrangement forming patterns that looked deliberate, even artistic. The signs had multiplied, each one adding a layer of explanation, turning what might have been dismissed as chaos into something that felt curated. The lawn had become an experience, and experiences, once discovered, tend to attract attention. It didn't take long for that attention to reach the HOA. The next notice arrived faster than expected, and its tone reflected a new kind of urgency. The language was no longer just about compliance. It spoke of unauthorized modifications, of increased foot traffic, of potential disruption to community standards. It attempted to reframe the issue, to shift the focus away from grass length and toward something broader, something that could justify stronger action. But the problem for the HOA was simple. The rules hadn't changed, and the lawn, as it now existed, didn't clearly violate them. That didn't stop the pressure from building. Another notice followed, then another. Each one slightly different, each one trying a new angle. Noise concerns, safety concerns, even vague references to liability. It was as though the HOA was searching for a justification that would stick, something that could bring the situation back under control. But control was slipping, because while the HOA was trying to contain the situation, the outside world was starting to amplify it. Photos of the lawn began to appear online. At first, they were scattered, posted without much context. Caption here, a comment there. But as more people visited, the posts became more frequent, more detailed, more intentional. Someone gave it a name. Not an official one, but something catchy enough to spread. And once it had a name, it had an identity. That identity turned the lawn from a local curiosity into something shareable, something searchable, something that people could talk about even if they had never seen it in person. The visitors changed after that. They weren't just curious anymore. They were purposeful. They came with expectations, with cameras, with the kind of energy that suggested they had already decided the lawn was worth their time before they even arrived. Weekends became busier. Cars slowed down more often. Some stopped. Others circled back. The quiet rhythm of the neighborhood began to shift, subtly at first, then more noticeably. And with that shift came tension. Not from everyone. Some neighbors seemed amused, even supportive. There was a certain satisfaction in seeing the rigid structure of the HOA being challenged, especially in a way that didn't involve direct confrontation. But others were less comfortable. They saw the visitors, the increased activity, the deviation from normalcy. And for them, normalcy was the point. It was what they had chosen when they moved into a place governed by rules and expectations. Now, that normalcy was being disrupted. And disruption in a place like this rarely goes unchallenged. The HOA responded the only way it knew how. It escalated. A formal meeting was scheduled, not the routine kind that passed without much attention, but one that carried a sense of importance. Notices were sent out, agendas were outlined, and the issue of the lawn was placed front and center. The goal was clear: reassert control. But control, once lost, is difficult to reclaim. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with quiet preparation. Not defensive, not reactive, strategic. Documentation was gathered. Regulations were reviewed. Evidence of compliance, of intent, of purpose, all carefully organized. Because this wasn't just about a lawn anymore. It was about precedent. The meeting itself drew more attention than expected. Residents who usually ignored HOA matters showed up. Some out of curiosity, others out of concern. The room carried an undercurrent of anticipation, as though everyone sensed that something important was about to unfold. The HOA presented its case. It focused on disruption, on the deviation from community standards, on the idea that one property was affecting the entire neighborhood. It used language that sounded authoritative, structured, confident. But beneath that confidence, there was uncertainty. Because every argument circled back to the same problem. There was no clear rule being broken. The response was measured, deliberate. It didn't attack. It didn't escalate emotionally. It simply pointed to the facts, the regulations, the lack of specific violations, the growing recognition of alternative landscaping practices. And then, something unexpected was introduced. Documentation of external interest. Articles, posts, mentions. Evidence that the lawn was no longer just a private matter. It was being noticed beyond the neighborhood. That shifted the tone of the room. Because the HOA wasn't just dealing with a resident anymore. It was dealing with attention. And attention brings scrutiny. The discussion became more complicated after that. What had seemed like a straightforward enforcement issue now carried potential consequences. Acting too aggressively could draw more attention. Ignoring it could signal weakness. The HOA found itself in a position it wasn't used to, reactive instead of proactive. The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but the outcome was obvious. Nothing had been enforced. The lawn remained, and outside, the visitors kept coming. If anything, the meeting had amplified the situation. Word spread that there had been an attempt to shut it down, that it had failed, that the lawn had survived its first real challenge. That narrative added fuel. The next wave of visitors was larger. Not overwhelming, not yet, but enough to change the atmosphere of the neighborhood in a way that couldn't be ignored. The lawn had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just interesting. It was becoming popular, and popularity, once it takes hold, tends to grow faster than anyone expects. The HOA watched, increasingly aware that the situation was slipping beyond its reach. The neighbor who had started it all watched too, but for different reasons, because what had begun as a simple complaint about an ugly lawn had turned into something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. And it wasn't finished as the days passed. A new development began to take shape, one that would push the situation even further, one that would bring in a level of attention that the HOA couldn't ignore, couldn't control, and couldn't easily fight. The shift from popular to unavoidable happened faster than anyone expected. It began with a single feature. Not a major news outlet, not a headline that dominated national attention, but something smaller and more focused. A digital publication that specialized in lifestyle trends, sustainability, and unconventional living spaces. It picked up on the growing online presence of the lawn, the steady stream of visitors, and the underlying story of resistance against rigid community standards. What made the story compelling wasn't just the visual transformation. It was the contrast, a single property, once labeled ugly, now standing in quiet defiance against an entire system built on uniformity. A homeowner who hadn't argued loudly, hadn't broken obvious rules, but had instead redefined the space so completely that the rules themselves struggled to apply. That narrative spread quickly. The article was shared, reposted, and discussed across platforms that valued creativity, sustainability, and unconventional thinking. The lawn was framed not as a problem, but as an example. A case study. A small act of defiance that had grown into something larger. And with that framing came a new kind of attention. The visitors changed again. They weren't just curious or entertained anymore. They were intentional. Some came with notepads, others with professional cameras. A few arrived with the kind of focused observation that suggested they were there to learn, not just to look. The lawn had become more than an attraction. It had become a destination. Weekends turned into steady streams of foot traffic. Weekdays no longer felt quiet. The once predictable rhythm of the neighborhood was replaced by something more dynamic, more unpredictable. Cars lined the streets more often. People moved through the pathways with a sense of purpose, following the natural flow that had been designed into the space. And the space held up. That was the part no one had expected. What had begun as a reaction, a refusal to conform, had evolved into something structured, resilient, and surprisingly sustainable. The plants thrived. The layout guided movement without damage. The informational signs gave context, turning casual observers into engaged visitors. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled, intentional growth. And that made it harder to dismiss. The HOA, however, had reached a breaking point. The situation had gone far beyond what their standard procedures could handle. Notices and fines had failed. Meetings had produced no resolution. The usual methods of enforcement no longer applied in a way that felt effective, so they escalated again. This time, it wasn't about warnings or penalties. It was about authority. A formal demand was issued, one that attempted to consolidate all previous concerns into a single, comprehensive directive. It referenced increased traffic, potential safety issues, and the broader impact on property values. It framed the lawn not as a single violation, but as a cumulative problem that required immediate correction. The expectation was clear: revert the lawn, restore the neighborhood's visual uniformity, end the attraction. But by that point, the situation had moved beyond simple compliance. Because the lawn wasn't just a private space anymore, it was public in everything but ownership. The response to the HOA's demand was, once again, measured. There was no emotional reaction, no escalation in tone, just a careful presentation of facts. Evidence that the space met existing guidelines. Documentation of its environmental benefits. Records showing that the increase in visitors had not resulted in damage, noise complaints, or measurable harm. And then, something more significant, proof of recognition. The lawn had been mentioned in additional publications, local blogs, community features, even a segment from a regional media outlet that highlighted unique spaces worth visiting. Each mention reinforced the same idea. This was not a problem. It was a point of interest. That changed the stakes entirely. Because the HOA was no longer just dealing with a resident. It was dealing with reputation. Taking aggressive action against something that had gained positive attention carried risk. The potential for backlash, for negative coverage, for scrutiny that extended beyond the neighborhood. All of it became part of the equation. And for the first time, the HOA hesitated. That hesitation created an opening, The lawn continued to grow. Not in size but in influence, more signs were added, refining the narrative. The pathways became more defined, improving the flow of visitors. Subtle adjustments were made to accommodate the increased attention, ensuring that the space remained functional, sustainable, and visually compelling. It wasn't just reacting anymore. It was evolving. And the evolution was being noticed. Neighbors who had once been skeptical began to shift their perspective. Some saw the steady stream of respectful visitors and realized that the disruption they had feared wasn't as damaging as they had imagined. Others saw the attention and recognized an unexpected benefit. The neighborhood, once anonymous, now had a point of recognition. Property values didn't drop. If anything, interest in the area increased. That was the detail that quietly undermined the HOA's position, because the argument that had been built around maintaining value no longer held the same weight. The lawn wasn't hurting the neighborhood. It was redefining it. The neighbor who had started it all found herself in a position she hadn't anticipated. The initial complaint had been simple, almost routine. A report filed with the expectation of quick compliance. A belief that the system would function as it always had, enforcing standards, maintaining order. But the system had been challenged. Not directly, not aggressively, but effectively, and now, the outcome was something she couldn't easily reverse. The lawn remained, the visitors continued, the attention grew, and the narrative had shifted in a way that placed her original complaint at the center of something much larger. Because without that complaint, none of this would have happened. The HOA eventually made its decision. Not a dramatic announcement, not a public reversal, but a quiet adjustment. Enforcement efforts were reduced. The language of future notices softened. The focus shifted away from the lawn and toward maintaining stability in other areas. It wasn't an admission of defeat. But it wasn't a victory either. It was something in between. A recognition that the situation had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. The lawn, once labeled ugly, had become something else entirely. A statement, an attraction, a reminder that rules, when pushed to their limits, sometimes reveal their own weaknesses. And in the end, the most effective form of resistance hadn't been confrontation. It had been transformation. What started as a simple patch of overgrown grass had turned into a space that people sought out, documented, and shared. A space that challenged expectations without breaking them. A space that proved that sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight the system directly,